Well, welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to look at the respiratory system, which serves the needs of cells by providing oxygen, a key molecule in cellular respiration, and by removing carbon dioxide, which is a waste product from cellular respiration. So let's see how the respiratory system accomplishes this goal of helping out cells. So the goal of the respiratory system is gas exchange. Some gases must diffuse across the lung surface into the bloodstream, and other gases must diffuse out of the bloodstream into the lungs. And this implies that the lungs must have, can you figure it out? Yep, you're right, a huge surface area. In fact, if the surface area of the lung were rolled flat, it would occupy the area of a standard tennis court. Let's see how this occurs, but before we do that, let's learn the anatomy of the respiratory system and trace the path of gases through the system. So here we have a picture of the respiratory system. And one way to think about the lungs they are a system of narrowing tubes that terminate in clusters of spherical cavities. So we're going to see how this works. Gases flow inward from the atmosphere through the nasal and oral cavity, which means you can breathe with your nose or your mouth. And then they go into the trachea, this tube right here, which divides into two bronchi, one going to each lung. And then finally, the bronchi split into many, many ever smaller bronchioles. And at the terminus of the bronchiole are the alveoli, which are spherical areas, and I'll show you a picture of them in a second. One thing in this diagram you should note is the larynx, which occurs right here. That is the voice box. And since we produce sound by passing air through the larynx, it makes sense that the larynx would be associated with the respiratory system. So the main tubes of the lungs are called the bronchi, and they branch into thousands upon thousands of very small tubes, the bronchioles. At the end of each bronchiole are the spherical clusters of alveoli, which I'm going to show you. So here they are, and you can see the bronchiole terminates in these clusters of spheres, each one an alveolus, taken together, the alveoli. These, of course, increase the surface area for gas exchange. As you probably noted in that last diagram, each cluster of alveoli is surrounded by a capillary network, in other words, blood vessels, and gases can diffuse down their concentration gradients to and from the blood. The blood in the capillary network is oxygen poor since it is just returned from the cells where cellular respiration occurred, and it is CO2 rich as a result. Thus, diffusion will cause oxygen to go from the atmosphere inside the lungs into the blood, and carbon dioxide from the blood into the atmosphere that is in the lungs. Here, once again, is the picture of the bronchioles getting ever smaller, terminating in this cluster of grapes we call the alveoli, surrounded by a capillary network or capillary bed. The gas exchange occurs as follows. The red blood cells actually move through the capillaries of the alveoli, single file. This, therefore, enhances the ability for gas exchange to occur. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the bloodstream into the lumen of the alveolus, and oxygen diffuses in. It doesn't necessarily happen in sequence like you're seeing in here. As soon as the blood enters the capillary, oxygen can begin diffusing in, and CO2 can begin diffusing outward. And they do this because each gas molecule moves down its concentration gradient by diffusion. In blood cells, there is a molecule called hemoglobin. It is hemoglobin that carries the oxygen from the capillaries in the lungs to the capillary beds where the cells can then use it. Hemoglobin is a protein, therefore there are genes for hemoglobin. It is composed of 4 polypeptide chains of 2 different types. They're called cleverly alpha and beta. And you can see here an alpha chain and a beta chain. And something else you can notice, inside each folded polypeptide is a large organic molecule depicted here called a heme. And in the middle of the heme is an iron ion. The oxygen actually attaches to this heme. And so you can see there are 4 hemes in a hemoglobin, and that means that blood, when it leaves the lung, typically carries 4 oxygens. When the blood returns from the body to the lungs, typically only 1 of the oxygen atoms has been removed and therefore needs to be replaced. At the bottom here, we have a space-filling diagram, which is an attempt to show you what the 3-dimensional shape of hemoglobin looks like. So let's now talk about breathing and how that works. Breathing is an automatic process. We call it autonomic because it's controlled by nerves of which we do not need to be conscious, although we can consciously control our breathing. But when we're not thinking about breathing, it happens automatically. And it facilitates gas exchange by bringing fresh atmosphere into your lungs, which has high amounts of oxygen, and expelling the atmosphere in your lungs, which is high in carbon dioxide. To breathe in, the muscles of the rib cage contract and expand the rib cage, while the diaphragm, this muscle on the lower side of the thoracic cavity, contracts and moves downward. This increases the volume of the lungs and air rushes in. Now, to breathe out, rib cage muscles relax, as does the diaphragm. This makes the thoracic cavity smaller and air is forced out. Finally, what I want to talk to you today is lung disease. Lung disease can be categorized in 3 different ways. There are airway diseases. These are ones that affect the tubes that carry the gases. They constrict or block the tubes. Examples of this are asthma and COPD, which I'll talk about in a second. Then there are lung tissue diseases. When the lung tissue gets scarred or inflamed chronically, it makes the lungs less flexible and therefore breathing becomes difficult. Also included in lung tissue diseases is lung cancer. And finally, we have lung circulation diseases, which means that the capillary beds surrounding the alveoli can become damaged, clotted, scarred, inflamed, and this reduces the ability of the lung to exchange gases with the capillary bed. And an example of this is pulmonary hypertension or high blood pressure in the lung capillary beds, and I'll talk about that in a second. COPD stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It is caused by inflammation of the lining of the bronchioles, and that's also known as bronchitis, and or by destruction of the alveoli, which is known as emphysema. So emphysema and bronchitis are the 2 major causes of COPD, which is a chronic condition that cannot be cured, but can be treated and its effects reduced through medicine. And this shows you the importance of not allowing the linings of your lungs to be damaged by certain pollutants. Asthma is a condition in which the airways narrow because the tissue on the wall of the bronchioles swells as a result of an immune system reaction, and additional mucus may be produced, and therefore smaller passageways and mucus combine to make breathing difficult. Asthma can be treated, but once again, it is typically not able to be cured. Exposure to pollutants during childhood development of the lungs causes asthma in some cases. Finally, pulmonary hypertension means that high blood pressure in the capillary beds around the alveoli damages or destroys these capillary beds, and that therefore reduces the ability of the lungs to exchange gases with the circulatory system, and you can understand why that would be a problem. One of the most common ways that pollutants are introduced to the lungs is through smoking of cigarettes. And I'll leave you with this picture of smokers' lungs, and you can guess which is which. By the way, this large bulbous organ here is the heart. So that's it for today. I hope you understand the anatomy of the respiratory system and how that increases surface area so that gas exchange is enhanced. In addition, you've learned a few of the diseases of the respiratory system, and I hope you have a better understanding of them. You have a little studying to do, And then after that, go outside, take a look at nature, ask biological questions, bring them back to class, and I'll see you soon.